Unit 3 Social, Human and Gender Development Contents 3.1 Introduction, 3.2 Development as Realization of Human Potential, 3.3 Impact of Development on Women, 3.4 Women as a Constituency in Development Politics, 3.5 Identification of Gender Need, Role and Strategy, 3.6 Perspective of Women and Development, 3.7 Conclusion, 3.8 Further Reading. Learning Objectives. The central objective of this unit is to explain development as a realization of human potential, impact of women on development, gender need, gender role and strategy in development, and emerging perspective of development on women. 3.1 Introduction. In the earlier units of this course, you have learned several important concepts like change, evolution, progress, growth, and development. In this unit, we shall be focusing on the social, human, and gender aspect of development. In the second half of the first unit of this course, we have discussed at length the human aspect of development. In the second unit, we have also discussed the various perspectives on change, modernization, and development. As a continuity to earlier discussion, this unit begins with the discussion of the objectives of the development. We discuss how the issues of justice, sustainability, and inclusiveness, satisfaction of fundamental human needs, participation of the masses in the development process, etc., have emerged to be an integral part of the contemporary development discourse. Women have always been an important constituency in development. However, impact of development on women have not always been positive. Rather, many of the development practices have put women in disadvantageous position in various ways. The impact of ongoing development process on women, especially intensification of gender inequality, increasing double burden of reinforcing the gender role stereotypes, feminization of labor, increase in women hardship and drudgery, etc., are outlined in this unit. In recent decades, various perspectives of women's development have been thought of. In the last section of this unit, we discuss some of these perspectives. 3.2 Development and Realization of Human Potential. The development is seen by some as a desirable state of being, and in this sense, a development society often connotes a modern industrial society that enjoys economic well-being as it has reached certain levels of wealth and consumption. Others see development as a vision wherein the center stage is occupied not by levels of production and consumption, but by the satisfaction of human needs and potentials. Let us examine some of these visions of development. A. Development as an expression of human personality. Dudley Sears, while elaborating on the meaning of development, suggests that while there can be a value judgment on what is development and what is not, it should be universally acceptable. It should be a universally acceptable aim of development to make for conditions that lead to realization of the potentials of human personality. Sears outlined several conditions that can make for achievement of this aim. First, the capacity to obtain physical necessities, particularly food. A job, not necessarily paid employment, but including studying, working on a family farm, or keeping house. Equality, which should be considered an objective in its own right. Participation in government, belonging to a nation that is truly independent both economically and politically, and educational levels, especially literacy. David Cotton, a leading proponent of alternative development, outlines three basic principles of what he called the authentic development. These are justice, sustainability, and inclusiveness. He says development must ensure the following. Justice. Priority must be given to assuring a decent human existence to all people. Sustainability. Earth's resources must be used in a way that ensure the well-being of future generation. Inclusiveness. Every person must have the opportunity to be a recognized and respected contributor to family, community, and society. Manfred and Max Neef, a Chilean economist and a recognized advocate of human rights and alternative development, disillusioned with the economic growth-based development experience in Latin American countries, talks of the new praxis based on the development focus on the satisfaction of fundamental human needs. He called this human scale development. The other salient features of this model of development are planning with autonomy, growing levels of self-reliance, coherent and balanced interdependence of people, nature and technology, balance between the personal and the social, constructive interplay of civil society with the state, and the emergence of global process alongside local activities. B. People's development. The people are held to be the principal actors in scale development. Respecting the diversity of the people as well as the autonomy of the spaces in which they must act converts the present day object person to a subject person in the human scale development. Development of the variety of that we have experienced has largely been a top down approach where there is a little possibility of popular participation and decision making. Human scale development calls for a direct and participatory democracy where the scale gives up its traditional paternalistic and welfarist role in a favor of a facilitator in enacting and consolidating people's solutions following from the below. Empowerment of people takes development much ahead of simply combating or ameliorating poverty. In this sense, development seeks to restore or enhance basic human capabilities and freedoms and enables people to be the agents of their own development. See, participation of the masses. In the process of capitalistic development and leading national economy towards integration into foreign markets, even politically democratic states are apt to effectively exclude the vast masses from political and economical decision making. The state itself evolves into a national oligarchy headed with authoritarian and bureaucratic structures and mechanisms that inhibit social participation and popular action. The limited access of the majority to social benefits and limited character of participation of masses can often not be satisfactorily offset by the unsuccessful and weak redistribute policies of the government. Powerful economic interest groups set the nation agenda of development, often unrepresentative of the heterogeneous and diverse nature of our civil society, making a consolidation and concentrations of power and resources in the hands of a few. Also, a focus of people and the masses implies that there could be many different roads to development and self-reliance. The slogans human-centered development, the development of people, integrated development all call for more inclusive and sensitive approach to fundamental social, economic and political change involved in development such that all aspects of life as of a people, their collectivity, their own historic and consciousness and their relations with other make for balanced advancement. The adoption of a basic needs approach with the concept of endogenous development make for a development agenda that is universally applicable while at the same time allowing for country specific particularities to be given due account. Denaturing diversity. The challenge of human scale development is to nurture diversity instead of being threatened by it, to develop process of political and economical decentralization, to strengthen democratic indigenous traditions and institutions, to encourage rather than repress emerging social movements, which reflect the people's need for autonomy and space. The fruit of economic development may be distributed more equitably if local spaces are protected, microorganisms are facilitated, and the drive collective identities that make up the social body are recognized and represented. Greater control of popular masses over environment is a must. In fact, this concept of development seeks for civil society rather than the state to own up and nurture development so that the role of social actors is enhanced. Development as an open process. Human scale development has a vision of real development not as a stage or a state but a process. A process that encompasses economic, social and technological changes by which human welfare is improved and embellished with its political, cultural and spiritual dimension. Above all, this conception frees development from any particular specification and development becomes an open opinion justifiable only to the extent the people need, understand and they are able to integrate it. The development must become a process in constant motion of for human being themselves as well as their surroundings which are in permanent motion, a motion that defies static boundaries and frozen directions. Social and human development therefore necessarily requires a unified approach, integrating the economic and a social component in plans, policies, and programs for the people's betterment. The challenge is to simultaneously integrate cross-sectorial and regional development needs as well as to make for a participative development. The issues of environment, pollution, women, habitat, hunger, and employment have come to the fore one by one and continue to require public and institutional attentions along with the resource allocation. Two major contemporary concerns that requires focus in many development initiatives are that of human security and sustainability. We need to ensure that the development does not mean social dislocation, violence, and war, and that we meet the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Each of these problems is interrelated in complex way and requires a unified approach. The purpose of development should be to develop man and not be end with the developing things. Fulfillment of basic needs of mankind should be the true objective of development, and achievement that either do not contribute to their goals or even disrupt their basic requirement must not be pursued as a development goal. Reflections and action 3.1. What do you mean by development? What according to you should be the ideal objective of development and why? 3.3. Impact of development on women. Development is not gender neutral. While one argues for the equality and participation of whole human being, men or women, in the process of development, it is important that we are not indifferent to social implications of biology and the physical constraints it puts for women. Women and the development is a theme that raises issues of equality and justice for women's experience of development as mediated by both their biology and the social construction of it. Intensification of gender inequality. Gender inequality tends to lower productivity and efficiency of labor at the level of economy, not just household, and intensify unequal distributions of resources. Lack of security, opportunity, and empowerment, along with the imply of lowering the quality of life for both men and women. Even when women and girls may bear the direct cost of gender inequality, it needs to be recognized that the ultimate cost of lack of development and poverty have to be borne by people across the society. Women's development is therefore simultaneously a gender and a development issue, and the developmental planners need to be cognizant of women's subordination for centuries that has controlled women's mobility, their labor, sexuality, and fertility. Be mixed gain for women. As far as women are concerned, development had mixed gains for them, while it has widened women's opportunity and opened up the public sphere to those hitherto confined to the private sphere of family life by tradition and superstitious beliefs. Yet evidence from large parts of the world also show that women still face disparity in opportunities, and often development for the women has meant the widening of gap between the incomes of men and women and increased strains on their time and energies. Women are unfavorably represented in very large numbers in the unorganized sector, and where they work under oppressive and exploitatory conditions but find themselves restricted due to their biological and social responsibilities as well as the lower status they enjoy in society. See, intensification of double burden. In fact, women lost twice as the development planners have been unable to recognize the dual roles of women, whereby they bear children and at the same time carry out economic activities, and have, in their short-sighted definition of women as mothers, ignored and downgraded their economic function so as to classify them as economically dependents. On the one hand, the exclusive burden of child care makes women access to the market limited, and then the market itself excludes prestigious and well-paying jobs from them, doubting their ability to hold such jobs and perform in equally capacity to men. Also, the prevalent definitions of work as work when performed for money and work as work in the modern sector have also contributed to the making women's economic contribution invisible. These definitions, for instance, exclude women who work in the agriculture sector as members of a family living off farm land products, women engaged in exchange labor, household work, childcare, and many such activities that are not paid. D. Reinforce gender role stereotypes. Stereotypes of sex roles have resulted in a situations where even developmental interventions aimed at modernizing farming system have also only exacerbated the problem by targeting only men for inputs such as training, loans, and resources such as seeds, land, and so on. In case of the green revolution, wherein there is a high capitalization involved, better harvesting system have meant focus on good variety of seeds and fertilizers, and such mechanization that means less of labor's requirement, thus unemployment. It is a women who lose again Their traditional economic employment in farms and any alternative employment plan is done only for men, eroding women's role in traditional economy. This has widened the gap between men and women, reducing the status of women. Subsistence economics with a little specialization have been more equalitarian and just two women with a little differentiation between the status and of men and women. Civilization has created more functional specifications to the benefit of men and increasingly led to women being reduced to a dependency status as they separated from their erstwhile food production functions. Women, as they lost these functions in civilized societies, increasingly became economic liabilities and vulnerable to a host of patriarchal controls. Anthropological evidence shows that the civilization's influence and subsistence economies has meant decreased involvement of men in child rearing roles and in other household tasks. Development being largely defined in terms of economic activities has thus focused on men, ignoring women's traditional economic roles. Feminization of household. Changing of customary communal land tenure system to the concept of private property ownership and introduction of cash crops have been two important developments that eroded women's role in traditional economic system while favoring men and their rights over lands and crops. Also, the lure for the modern monetary economy has meant large-scale migration of men away from their household, such that women are left to perform additional tasks formerly done by men, reducing significantly women's leisure as well as productivity. Again, improved transportations and markets have had mixed benefits for women and men. While increased access to the market may have a positive impact of rural learning, it is also impact people in making several traditional occupations redundant. Local and handmade artifacts can seldom compete with the cheaper women-made goods. G. Differential access to education. Since 1980, a phenomenon called feminization of labor have been noted as a global development which refers to the process of decentralization of labor with the intention of reducing wage and non-wage cost of production. Women are preferred as employees for they are available on cheap, flexible, non-permanent terms as and can be disposed of whenever it is felt necessary to do so. No doubt, more women get an opportunity to work. However, that itself is no reason for any optimism for they do such works on increasingly less favorable terms. Similarly, structural adjustment programs and new economic policy are not seen in most feminist quarters as arguing well for women who are expected to be hit the worst by inflation and the winding up of the barest of welfare state measures. We have increased poverty with a female face, abandonment of women and children as the poor grapple for survival. Prostitution and violence are some of the alarming social consequences that are said to be on the flip side of economic development that is planned through the process of privatization, liberalization, and globalization. Education is widely regarded as one of the most important development initiatives to reduce gender disparity, and there are several researchers which show positive links between girls' education and economic productivity, maternal and infant mortality, fertility rates, and health prospects of future generation. If we look into the education and modernization and its effect on women, though we find that the elite nature of education is in most of the Israel colonial nations have meant that education has not reached rural population, particularly women. And there is still a wide gap between male and female literacy figures in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Lack of education was itself not a big problem when women engaged in traditional pursuit. However, with the development and accompanying changes wherein traditional occupations of women are being suppressed, it becomes difficult for poorly educated women to move into the new sectors. In the market, women come to be in a disadvantaged position because of their lack of knowledge and training, making for exploitative conditions of work and their inability to compete with the more favorably disposed men. Lack of education severely limits ability to take credit, innovate, and each independent income through economic enterprise. In case of migrations to cities, rural women often find themselves in less paying jobs as domestic servants, shop assistants, and even prostitutes. Education has all the same opened up a host of occupations for the middle and upper class And women of these classes have found representations in services like teachers, nurses, and doctors. New job opportunities in computers and information technology has spurred many middle class women to a substantially paying jobs. However, it must be remembered that by and large, women's economic activities are permitted to them only in situations of family crisis, when women are required to earn and additional income without changing the distribution of work at home. In countries like India, educated women often enter prestigious services due to several factors working in their favor, which is supportive family structure that takes pride in their education and employment, and the availability of cheap labor for taking care of household jobs are very important. At the same time, women's work outside the confines of the house is not without its problem. Diverse separations and increase in the number of women's headed households may have a link with the increased hostility between men and women. For while women are required to work double shift, men continue to keep off the home sphere. A related issue of concern is the contemporary increase in the violence and crime against women, which plays its function in maintaining women's subordination by restricting them from free and full participation in development initiatives. Environmental degradation and increasing hardship for women. Similarly, if you look at the development and its impact on the environment, we find that the distribution of the previous balance of nature through unbridled pursuit of men's capitalistic interest have affected women more severely than it has men, as they struggle and search for fuel, carry water over long distance, and spend unduly long hours processing food. Women's overwhelming involvement in subsistence related activities has meant that the environmental degradation translates into a special hardship for them, for the ready access to natural resources they enjoyed earlier is replaced by working harder to get access to them, often having to pay for what was otherwise communally owned. The new technology and increase in women's drudgery. The dominant discourse of development often draws women as victims of household drudgery. The technology in the form of household appliances and modern science is seen as the panacea of all the troubles. However, this technology is not really all the emancipatory, for much of its environment pollution and degradation is linked to this technology. It needs to be noted that women are aware of the links between a balanced and undegraded nature and human survival, as it is women who have taken the leadership and sought solidarity across the world in their struggle against the capitalistic plundering of nature and environment, be it on the issue of building large dams, the saving of mangrove forest, the building of atomic power plants, or mining chalk and other resources. This is not to say that development is not for women. Rather than the development interventions based on certain stereotypes of women have bypassed them. They have negatively affected their productivity and many times even created obstacles in women's lives when they are actually intended to facilitate them. Development interventions have either prioritized the women's motherhood role or her economic agency while neglecting the other half of her role, thus creating a situation wherein women in their pursuit of development goals do not find themselves anywhere getting to be equal to men. While they have lost the protections and advantages of sexually segregated society, they have not been able to get the freedom and status that development promised through reinventing their economic lives. Reflections and Action 3.2. Make an observation on the economic and social condition of female laborers working either in agriculture or in construction in your neighborhood. Based on your observation, write a note on the change in social and economic status of women laborers in your neighborhood. 3.4. Women as Constituency in Development Policies. It was only in the 1970s that development policy oriented itself to women as a distinctive category rather than a residual one. Development planners of the time were faced with the failure of the trickle-down theory, which problem of poverty and employment that seemed to have aggregated with economic growth, and with the need to focus basic needs and poverty alleviation in the second decade of development. At around the same time, the women's movement gave a strong voice to the idea that women's issues have development policy implications. Several studies highlighting the women's productive activities, especially women's critical role in food production, women's preponderance among the poor of the world, and researchers linking the women's fertility to their status in their society came to the fore and substantiated the need to integrate women in development goals. Thus, the UN Decade for Women was declared. This brought about a marked change in how development came to be directed at women. Therefore, in 1970, policymakers have focused on women in very gender-specific ways, while men are targeted for development as household heads and the breadwinners. Women are seen primarily as mothers and dependents, hence were beneficiaries of welfare measures rather than development itself. The welfare categories has its obvious negative connotation, for it is seen in most quarters as a residual category made of dependents who fail to be in self-reliant, hence must be helped. Since women were typecast in their sex roles without reference to the reality of developing and underdeveloped countries, the kind of initiative directed for them were programs of nurturing training, nutritional training, home economics, maternal and children's health care, and family planning. This assumption of family domesticity came to be challenged by researchers that pointed to women's productive role and involvement in basic needs of their families. Development initiatives thereafter transferred this insight into income enhancing programs for women, as women came to be conceptualized as managers of low income households. For most purpose, during this interim phase, development initiatives for women retained their welfareist projections and avoided any redistributive outcomes. It was much later, 1980s, when the world economy was undergoing deterioration, that there came about a growing emphasis on women as an economic agents in their own right. It came to be realized that women's productive capacities had been underutilized, and as economic restructuring came to be prescribed through process of liberalization and privatization, it came to be hoped that the free market enterprises would make for a more efficient usage of human resources, both male and female. During this time, women first came to be given focus as key agents of the development process and are engaged to take up micro enterprises, small scale business ventures, and parallel marketeering. However, this emphasis of women's economic agency has its serious pitfalls. The basic subordinations of women and exclusive responsibility of home and childcare continue, and with structural adjustment programs and the wrapping up of the state welfare measures, this responsibility only increased, thus making unreasonable demands on women's time and energies. The free market itself is not all the free for women to enter the market with these disadvantages end up getting more exploited. The efficiency approach of the women's development gain does not go very far in making change for better conditions of women's lives, for equality of men to men. The old fable of the fox and the stork, that both needed food to be served differently to them to be able to eat, in an appropriate analogy to explain the differential needs of men and women. Feminists have sought to influence developmental planners with the idea that for achieving developmental goals of freeing women for their subordination and achieving gender equality, recognition needs to be given to the gender division of labor in production and reproduction. This would be lead to a better appreciation of the differential needs of men and women. Equality and empowerment cannot be achieved in policy approaches that merely add women to existing developmental plans. Development policies must be based on a social relation framework and that accounts of the differences in gender roles and needs. Additionally, development policy cannot be justifiably premise itself on a universal category women which does not exist. There are material differences in power sources and interest of women across the world that effectively stand distinguished and denied behind the concept of women's development, as a fact that came to be deeply resented by women's groups in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Development does not operationalize itself in terms of uniform benefits for all men and disadvantages for all women. Women are on structurally disadvantaged term with the men, but when then third world men are women and structurally disadvantages to be compared to the first world men and women. Dawn development alternatives with women for a new era. A network of third world activities proposed, therefore, that the strategies for a more equitable development need to be worked out from the vantage point of the most oppressed women who have disenfranchised by class, race, and nationality. Only then can be the complexities of subordination be fully taken care of in developmental agendas. Over the years, these insights have influenced development policies, and achievement of equality, equity, and empowerment become legitimate developmental goals of women across the world. 3.5 Identification of gender need and role. Need, role, and strategy. Two important conceptual rationales forwarded for recognizing women as the distinct constituency in development and gender relations as a necessity framework for planning and implementing of development policies needs to be discussed in greater details. These are gender roles and needs and control over resources and decision making within the households, gendered men and women and the household. Women are presumed to be beneficiaries of development as part of the families and household targeted for development. It was pointed out by the feminist researchers that women and men have different roles in the household and society, making for differential access to resources and power within households. Therefore, women's need for development cannot be realistically be merged into those that of others in the household. This aggregation of the household or family on the basis of gender was therefore the first principle proposed by planning for development that was responsive to the distinct realities of men and women. Caroline Moser found that the development fell short of people's, especially women's needs, due to the certain widespread stereotypes among development planners about the structure of low-income household, division of labor inside them, and the power and control of resources within the household. More specifically, she found that three faulty assumptions that emanated from a Western perspective and that distorted development initiatives as they had no roots in third world contexts. These are that the household consists of nuclear family of husband and wife and 2 or 3 children, that the household function as a socio-economic unity within which there is equal control of resources and power of decision making between all adult members in matter of influencing household livelihood. Third, within the household there is a clear division of labor based on gender. The man on the family and the breadwinner is primarily involved in productive work outside the home, while the women, as the housewife and the homemaker, takes care of responsibility for the reproductive and domestic work involved in organization of the household. Firstly, the nuclear family with the neutralized division of labor is an idealized concept that distorts reality. It has also been pointed out that the household as a residential unit is distinct from families, the latter being a social unit that is based on ties of marriage and kinship, and the through of often these correspond yet an assumption of they being one and the same bound to lead to misconceptions about the nature of the development needs to the units targeted. Moreover, not only do households show heterogeneity in their structures and composition, it is also a fact that the women occupancy different positions in these structures. To treat the family, therefore, as a static unit without the socio-economic context and the contemporary pressures that make for constant reconstructions of such units in bound to be problematic. For instance, although it is normally assumed that the head of the household is a man, the situation is quite different in actually with the women-headed households showing an increase with the desertion, death and male migration, situations of war, insecurity and disaster. Female dependency is constructed on a false assumption that men are the breadwinners and financial supporters of dependent women. While this may be a feature of industrial societies, in some cases it is a restricted phenomenon and does not represent the low-income households and their relatives, where women are very often the primary or the sole earners. In the Caribbean, large part of Latin America and Central America and parts of Africa, headed households form a sizable proportions of the economically vulnerable, often falling below the poverty line, where the mother is the only adult income earner and there are several dependent children. Poverty manifests itself in children dropping out of education, working, and in making for an intergeneralization transfer of poverty. Women balance multiple roles in the household, and the assumptions of their economic dependence on men can seriously impact policy against their interest. There have been many instances when false assumptions of women's role in family resulted in their labor and participation in agriculture being discounted and they be excluded from developmental initiatives involving ownership of land, credit extensions, and other services. Similarly, faulty assumptions about the household or as a natural socioeconomic unit presuppose first that a family provides equal control over family resources to all its members, and that adult house members share between them the power of household decision making. The importance of intra household dynamics is inequitable distributions of resources and unequal exchanges of labor, and its fruits is ignored and questions of power and control left unaddressed. Arguments about the economic rationality of the household behavior contradict the complex array of relationships and interactions within the household and treat the household as an individual decision maker. However, the treatment of household as the most relevant unit of utility maximization removes the possibility of exploring and treating conditions of unequal exchanges and exploitation between family members. Empirical evidence exists that there are conflicts of interest between men and women, as well as the interdependence, and that gender inequalities are often rationalized through bias in perception of individual contributions and interest of men and women. There are economic as well as cultural and ideological reasons that underlie such asymmetries in intra-household resource allocation. However, it is commonly supposed that the altruism governs family relations and individual family members subordinates individualism in pursuit of the common goal of the welfare of the family. Marriages, especially, are assumed to be cushioned with love and sacrifice for the conflicts that dog other social institutions. However, the belief that marriages and families mean a partnership between men and women, then that is shared on the basis of common objectives, and where there is a reciprocity in rights and obligations that make for a joint control and management of resources, such as that each has access to pooled resources according to his or her need, beliefs, reality. First, the household may not necessarily be a collectivity of reciprocal interest. Even though sharing may be the dominant principle of household distribution, it does not mean that everyone has to equal access to resources. Gender is an important element of defining people's access to resources, especially scarce ones. For example, women routinely get to eat in poor households are socialized to bear hardships so that their men can get better care and resources. Material altruism is held to maternal altruism is held to be a womanly virtue, and its most homes it is the women's obligations to routinely sacrifice food, leisure, health, and entertainment so that the men can have a bigger share of this. Likewise, women often do not have direct access to household assets and properties, and have many control over this solely by virtue of being wives or mothers of male relatives. In contrast, men have direct access to property and cultural sanctions of independent decision making. Household distribution of labor and responsibility also play an important role in circumscribing equal opportunities of men and women in the market, and these limitations of women's ability to expand income and generating activities pushes them back to the dependency status, vulnerable to violence and intra-household inequality. It has also been pointed out that the management and distribution of resources within the household takes place differentially with the men and women at the helm of affairs, and it is linked to a gender-based responsibility of the two sexes. Studies across the world show that women's income is largely used to pay for the day-to-day food, clothing, and domestic goods, and thus this is household provisioning implies that a greater share of women's income covers subsistence and nutrition needs of the family as compared to that of men. It need to be underlined that the assumptions of the male head as a benevolent caretaker cannot be stretched too far, and that the head cannot by himself represent household needs. Therefore, his welfare too cannot be taken to be a representative of the welfare of all household members. While it is true that in most of the case cultural rules, ideology, and practices make the intra-household distribution appear natural and legitimate, yet inequalities continue to exist between men and women share the bias in perception of their actual contribution to the household. Direct money earning by men is often perceived as a bigger contribution to the household, entitling men to a greater household resource than the women, whose time and energy spent on ensuring overall well-being of the family as well as in non-market activities that indirectly go to support the men's enterprises in all the market are discounted. Correct assignment of the individual interest as well as being for the planning development interventions therefore needs to be based on the generalized understanding of the dynamics of intra-household inequalities. B. Gender roles and the impact of women's development. Women, though often perceived as the dependents of as homemakers, are engaged in three basic responsibilities that they should, and these have been referred to be in developmental literature as their triple role. Firstly, women are engaged in reproductive work that revolves both childbearing and rearing. Secondly, most low-income households in the third world have their women engaged in what is called productive work or work that earns wages. In rural areas, this could be agricultural work. In urban areas, women work in large numbers in the informal sector in and around their homes. Thirdly, as part of their reproductive responsibility, women also take up community managing work that facilitate collective consumption needs of the neighborhood or the community. Despite these three roles, women's work is generally made invisible, for either their work is regarded as natural extension of their biological need of giving birth to children or nurturing them, or their work is considered secondary. Men, in contrast, are largely seen as productive workers, even when they may be unemployed, or earning erratically. As far as reproductive role is concerned, men do not have a clearly defined reproductive roles in most societies, and when involved in the community, men do not largely engage in consumption related voluntary work. Rather than they take up the community leadership roles that give them either some payment or social prestige. Feminists have identified this gender-based division of labor as both the reason and the expression of human subordination. They have contested the dualistic division of the work as a productive and reproductive, which essentially implied that the productive elements of reproductive works are compulsorized. It has been pointed out that the women's reproductive work both produces labor of force and maintain it, thereby making for the fundamental productive activity that is essential for all subsequent productive enterprises. Capitalist development is itself held responsible for this historical and artificial division between men and women's roles that later got enforced by ideology. Several feminists have traced this domestication of women to the Industrial Revolution, which created the modern cash economy that cut women off from their traditional subsistence activities and resulted in women's loss of autonomy as farmers, craft workers, or traders. The housewife's role that came to women as their primary responsibility, however, is neither valued nor paid, and the use value of reproductive work is not given the recognition it deserves. Even as far as the realm of productive work goes, the ideology of housewifization masks asymmetry in men and women's work and their exchange value. Not only do women get work at the lower end of the economy, which are low skilled and low paid and not earned by men, they are also vulnerable to exploitation and harassment and an overload of labor due to their multiple roles. Yet the unpaid work of women at home and in community and their low paid work in what is recognized as the productive sphere have not created major conflict in the rank and file of women, because they themselves accept and conform to the gender ascribed roles and find little choice. See, practical and strategic gender needs. Since in discussing development, the concept of human needs and their satisfaction has emerged an important criterion for assessing whether or not interventions lead to a development. It is important to look at the twin concept of practical and strategical gender needs when discussing gender development. Women and men have different roles in societies and therefore distinct priority concerns. Maxine Molyneux and conceptualized this distinction, which was later elaborated by Caroline Moser, while advocating to the development planners to be the more gender sensitive. According to Molyneux and Moser, there are women's interest and gender interest. The two are not the same. Women's interest refers to interest which women across the world share by virtue of being the biological sex female. Since in real life situations, women live in a society where their position is defined not merely by their sex but by other important factors like their class and ethnicity as well as gender, it would be wrong to present women's interest and needs as a homogeneous category for women, rather than while planning and development planners must take cognizance of the fact that women's interests and needs vary according to their social positioning and which itself is defined by the specific socioeconomic context and also by factors such as class, ethnicity, and religion. This makes for the importance of referring to the general interest that women share amongst themselves as gender interest, and the terminology changed to need in reference to planning for addressing them. Needs in reference to planning for addressing them. Planning for development and change itself focus on multiple levels of goals, as policy interventions can accomplish limited goals so that there is less confusion in what is aimed to and what is achieved. The distinction between strategic and practical need is very useful. Moser defines this: strategic gender needs are the needs women identify because of their subordinate positions to men in their society. Strategic gender needs vary according to a particular context. They relate to gender divisions of labor, power, and control, and may include such issues as legal rights, domestic violence, equal wages, and women's control over their bodies. Meeting strategic gender needs helps women to achieve greater equality. It also changes existing roles and therefore challenges women's subordinate position. Practical gender needs are the needs women identify in their socially accepted roles in society. Practical gender needs do not challenge the gender divisions of labor or women's subordinate positions in society, although rising out of them. Practical gender needs are a response to immediate perceived needs, necessity identified within a specific context. They are practical in nature and often are concerned with inadequacies in living conditions such as water provision, healthcare, and employment. It is evident that addressing strategic gender needs makes for a transformation in social relations such that women comes to enjoy greater equality and power, and that such a transformation is depend on consciousness of a different order and a commitment to struggle against the prevalent order. Practical gender needs, since they are addressed to make for better adaptation to women's concrete condition in the domestic arena or in income generating activities or even in community based resources, do not result in such transformations, though they generally provide relief to women in their gendered roles and responsibilities. The greater majority of developmental interventions aim at addressing women's practical gender needs and do not contribute to directly to challenging either the sexual division of labor or social, political, and economic organizations of society that subordinates women. However, it would not be right to term strategic needs based depend interventions to be feminist and the intervention directed at improving women's access to their practical needs as less feminist, for the two are linked and in effect often inseparable. Reflections and action 3.3. How do gender roles affect women's participation in the development process? Answer this question with suitable illustrations. 3.6. Perspectives on women and development. There are several important perspectives of women's development. Let us examine a few of them here. A structural perspective. Structural perspectives of women are of development. Structural perspectives on development are critical of the women in development approach of developmental policies, for they start with the basic assumption of conflicts in society that makes for competition for resources and power, and that manifests itself in struggle of classes and groups such that dominations and oppression have a structural base. Change itself in existing system is seen not in terms of accommodation and reforms, but in radical and revolutionary transformations that result in a more fair redistribution of resources and power. Marxism forms an important wellspring for the critical conflict. Marxism holds, like the WID approach, that development as an economic modernization or capitalistic development has led to the marginalization of women in the third world. However, it goes further than the women in development approach in seeing sexual inequality at a deeper structural and dialectical level, and linking into the uneven and unequal worldwide development of capitalism and to inequalities embedded in social classes. However, there is a criticism that Marxism fails to deliver what it promises for, while it explains the capitalist development as a system of hierarchical structures of production that lead to the emergence of a small but powerful minority with resources and a much larger disposed majority, and that stands alienated from the means of production. It could be itself not explain women's subordination further to the subordination of men that is created by the capitalistic mass production. Feminists have critiqued it at also reducing women's oppression to the abstract concept of a particular mode of production, thereby not paying an attention to the fact that men, and not just the abstract concept of capital, benefit from women's oppression. The agency and consciousness of human being as social actors stands completely denied in these conceptualizations, for the individual is defined purely in relation to class interest. Women oppression to male domination and control is itself dismissed as false consciousness and the result of divisive strategies of the ruling minority. Not satisfied by this explanation, some feminists reworked with the basic Marxist argument to explain female subordination as a part of new constraints that came about as a result of inequalities generated by capital-intensive development on global scale. One stream of feminists hitched their arguments to the dependency theories, further the argument that capitalist mode of production has polarizing tendencies and creative a relationship of dependency between the peripheral nations of the third world with the metropolitan centers of the first world, such that women's development is adversely affected in the third world peripherals countries, even while women in the first world may not to enjoy opportunities either too inaccessible. This theorists draw a Rosa Luxemburg's thesis that pre-capitalistic forms of production provide an essential subsidy to capital accumulation. Saffioti suggested that the family was an example of such a pre-capitalistic form of production that aided capital accumulation by drawing on the labor of women, their time and energies without adequate payment, because the family is organized in such a way that voluntaristic sentiments rather than the contractual labor marks the production of relations. Capital accumulation could take place in the metropolitan centers of the coast of women in the third world countries that had to grapple with increasing poverty and marginalization. Even while their unpaid labor or their reserve labor was called upon to benefit the capitalistic system, a pervasive patriarchal sex role ideology was held to be the direct cause of women's subordination, for its rationalized women's confinement to home on the basis of her biology and social role. Dependency feminists thus worked out connections between different forms of inequalities at the international, national, and household levels. Yet, like the Marxist approach, they held the view that the men and women held common classes interest and did not see the rationale for the material exploitation of women in their households by men. Sexual aggression and subordination by men was attributed to the frustration and helplessness of men involved in exploitative capitalistic production, thus ignoring the relationship of men and women itself in terms of a set of production relation wherein production of people itself was undervalued in comparison with the production of things with exchange value. Maria Mies, a German feminist, while drawing again on Luxemburg's thesis, has disagreed with the priorities of a class as the primary contradiction and sees the first contradiction to be that of gender. The basic biological difference between men and women, according to Mies, mean that the women experience their relationship with the nature and their environment differentiality. They experience their whole bodies as productive and in tune with the nature, unlike men who could produce with their hands and the tools that became an extension of these hands. According to Mies, man's relationship with nature was predatory for the beginning, and in his lust for power, man established a similar relationship with women whom seemed to be like nature. She sees capitalism as a more recent manifestation of a male patriarchal patriarchal order that came into force far back in the history of mankind, when men realized that the destructive tools that they could make could be used to domesticate women and animals, thus make for appropriation of economic surplus. Since women came to be seen as providing the essential physical preconditions for male production, men made women as their first colony. All subsequent development is likewise marked by the same predatory mode of production. Colonization and housewifization are two ways that women and the weak are reduced to being nature, and thence their control and exploitations became justified. Mia's account deviates from traditional Marxist account that in it establishes the relationship between men and women as a relationship of power, and instead of blaming capitalism for women oppression, blames patriarchy. She traces different forms of violence on women as a manifestation of patriarchy irrespective of its form in different production systems, and exploitation and oppression as the common denominator for both first world and their third world women. Men anywhere, everywhere are held to be violent, for they uphold the global patriarchal hierarchy, but since the white men currently control the technology of destruction, males hold them more culpable than men elsewhere. Reflection section 3.4. What do you mean by housewifization? In your opinion, how can this process be broken? B. Gender relations framework. Both the structural explanation outlined above make global generalizations about the effect of women, of capitalism, and its interplay with patriarchy. These have been critiqued by a group of women who promoted the gender analytical approach to development for being too monolithic to be of such use in practice. At the same time, the WID promotion of the category women in development was also found wanting to exclusive focus on women creates women and men as isolable categories. Those who promote the gender analytical approach adopt social relationship of gender as their chief analytical category, and extended Marxist concept of social relationship beyond the production of objects and commodities to areas of gender relations such as procreation, care of children, old and sick, and to what all comes under the daily reproduction of labor. Instead of seeing power rooted in men and denied to women in all circumstances, this approach sees power in general inherent in gender relations. While it explains women's subordination in gender relationship in household, and it does not limit itself to the household, and analyzes how asymmetrical gender relationships spring from the household, interact, relate, and define relationship in the broader economic arena. Gender relations thus are not merely male-female relations. They refer to the full assembly of social relationships, though which men becomes men and women become men. More than women become women, more than the sex, it is the socially differentiated arrangements and patterns of gender behavior and relations that defines the differential experience of the world by men and women. The gender relations framework thus frees woman and man from any biologistic determinism, while at the same time not negating the fact of different sex bodies leading to different rules and practices coming into operation so as to define gender relations and make for gender inequality. The framework goes further to emphasize that other social relations such as class, race, ethnicity, religion, etc. mediate to define and translate gender inequality, so that neither class nor sex nor any other attribute has prominence over other as a determining principle of individual identity, social position, or power. By rethinking of men and women without a universal structure of patriarchy, the gender relationship approach make it possible for constructing gender subordination in different societies, communities, institutions, and arenas of actions in a historically specific manner, thus making for a more realistic and pragmatic attempt at changing how men and women work, live, and relate. Ascriptions of gender roles is often done discreetly. It may be implicit rules and practices that promote one gender rather than the others, and there are strong biologistic ideologies supporting them. In many gender discriminatory practices like the sexual division of labor, construction of an elaborate and sacrificial motherhood, or violent and aggressive manhood stand to be questioned more logically once it is realized that they are neither instinctual nor dictated by biology. Rather, it is an elaborate social system of gender relations that defines them, and that privilege one gender over the other in terms of resources and power. Lastly, development planners must realize that gender is never absent. Though family is a crucial site for the beginning of its operation, it operates as a pervasive allocation principle determining the participation of men and women in all social institutions. It links production with reproduction, the domestic domain with the public domain, and the microeconomic units with the larger economy. A gender relationship approach has the advantage of being an inductive mode of analysis and can then explain empirically found contradictions of subordinations and power and the multiplicity of outcomes of developmental interventions, sometimes emancipatory, sometimes making for more oppressive and subordinating conditions for women across the world. See, empowering women for development, very closely connected with the issues of women's development in the question of women's empowerment. But what does empowerment means and how can development bring it to about? The term is contentious, that it important not to be equivalent to greater participations of women in economic activities, for economic activities do not always improve women's condition and often add extra work burden on her. The term empowerment has within its a highly contentious concept of power with which is understood differently by different people. In an article, What is Empowerment? Joe Rowlands makes a distinction between power over and power to. The first implying that some people have power or control over others, hence an instrument of domination, and the second as a generative power, a power to stimulate, to lead without a conflict of interest, a power that does not seek to dominate or subordinate, rather than a power that can resist and challenge the cohesive intentions of power over. Empowerment generally is defined as a beginning bringing women from outside the definition making process into such that they have access to political structures and decision making, to markets and income, and more generally to a state where they are able to maximize opportunities without constraints of the family, community, or the state. A feminist definition of empowerment, however, is broader, for it demands as a consciousness of one's own interest and how they relate to the interest of others, so that the decision making is based on knowledge of self and others and as an assessment of ability to exert influence. Empowerment in the feminist sense would imply a realization of the power over as well as the power to resist, negotiate, and change. The ability to act and exert influences thus requires the empowerment to understand the internalized oppression as well as the dynamics of oppression, such that the power is not given or received, rather it comes from within. Empowerment is thus a process, and development itself should not be confused as empowerment. In some of its policies of the state, it has been pointed out the goal of development should be women's empowerment. This implies that women again gain in self-confidence and take charge of creating for themselves the condition that will facilitate the maximization of their human abilities and potentialities. Reflections and Actions 3.5. You must read several stories on women empowerment in newspapers, journals, and magazines. Select any of the two stories from them and analyze the process involved in women's empowerment in the Indian society. 3.7 Conclusion. Gender issues and gender analysis are today regarded as significant and priority in development policy and planning. Since the 1970s, a number of things have been accomplished as integrating gender in development is concerned. There has been a lot of thinking on cultural stereotypes and changing them. Anti-discriminatory legislations in all walks of life has been passed, and the state and national machineries for looking into women's affairs have been successfully set up. However, there is a serious rethinking by feminists on their goals and strategies for mainstreaming gender in the development process. First, feminist theory ever since has taken the postmodern turn has itself found it increasingly difficult to have gender as a universal reference point for analysis as well as action. The deconstruction of gender and women, while on the other hand an acknowledgement of multiple and distinctive social identities of women and their often contradictory political interests, yet on the other is a vastly confusing. For if there are no shared gender interests of women across countries and the world, then it makes little sense of privileging gender in development planning and interventions. Also, while a lot of feminist passion went in bringing the issues of gender on a center stage in the development discourse, Feminists have realized that developmental agencies, nations, and their missionaries have co opted the feminist vocabulary without either incorporating the ideology or translating into sufficient and necessary action to change the realities of women. Women have been offered a tokenistic and marginalized position with little or no access to power. That state, even when it appears to be democratic, progressive, and proactive, seemingly offering space to women for renegotiating and rights and privileges. In actuality, implements policies and programs that have strong shades of capitalistic and patriarchal control and women's concerns are the best incorporated in a superficial and fragmented manner. Policy documents which incorporate states' vision of equality and justice to women are prepared every now and then. However, these largely remains as pieces of paper and only contribute to the increasing volume of state rhetoric on women. In this unit, we have covered a vast area of related to gender issues in development. As a human being is at the center stage of all development, the gender issue can no more be neglected if we are to make development sustainable. Here we discussed the impact of development on women as a constituency of development, and various perspectives on women's development. 3.8 further reading. There is books like the Reverse Realities, Gender Hierarchies in Development Thought. That book is New Economic Policy and Development of Women, Issues and Implications, and The Violence of Development, A Choice for Intellectuals. These were the few readings. This is the end of the Unit 3 on the subject Sociology of Development. Thank you very much.